They dragged a black man out of first class for asking too quietly. And within hours, the airline was on its knees. No shouting, no threats, just skin color, silence, and a decision made by someone who thought they'd never be held accountable. It started with a simple request and ended with a scandal that tore through corporate boardrooms and made national headlines. They didn't see him as worthy of the seat he paid for. They saw him as a problem to be moved. What they didn't know was that this man carried more power than the entire flight crew combined. This isn't just about one flight. It's about the cost of casual racism hiding behind company policy. And the twist? They didn't just pick the wrong man. They picked the one man who could destroy them. You think you know how this ends? Think again. Like if you believe dignity isn't negotiable. Subscribe to see how the truth hits harder than any takeoff. And comment below, what would you have done if it happened in front of you? And where are you watching from today? We're listening. The afternoon light slanted through the terminal windows as Malik stepped onto Flight 819 with a kind of quiet, practiced composure that made him invisible to most. He wore no brand logos, no bold colors, just a crisp slate shirt tucked into well-fitted trousers, a leather messenger bag hanging from one shoulder. He didn't draw attention. He didn't need to. As he moved through the narrow aisle toward seat 2A, he offered polite nods where appropriate and settled into a spot with ease, placing his bag beneath the seat ahead and glancing briefly at the folded blanket resting in the overhead compartment. Empty. The cabin was colder than expected, the airflow sharp along the window. He waited until boarding had mostly cleared, then lifted his hand subtly as the flight attendant passed. She was blonde, late 40s maybe, her uniform pristine and posture stiff with the air of someone who had seen 1,000 flights and forgotten every name. She glanced toward him without stopping, continued forward with the practiced rhythm of someone who had already decided who mattered. Malik lowered his hand slowly. A few minutes passed. She returned, now offering drinks across the row, and again he raised a hand, more direct this time, palm slightly turned upward in a silent gesture. This time she stopped. Her tone was clipped, not rude, just precise, empty of warmth. Need something? Malik nodded once, gesturing gently toward the overhead bin. The temperature's a little low, he said calmly. A blanket would be appreciated. Her smile thinned, eyes barely meeting his. Sit tight, I'll see if we have any left. She turned and moved off without waiting for a reply. Malik blinked, looked out the window. Across the aisle, an older white man in 2B waved casually for attention. Same request. The same attendant returned moments later, this time with a full smile, dropping a folded blanket directly into the man's lap with a gentle nod. Here you go, sir. Let me know if you need anything else. Malik caught the exchange in the reflection of the window. No eye contact, no word spoken to him, just absence. He adjusted his posture, pulled a slim paperback from his bag, and opened it to the page he'd marked on his last trip. Halfway through a chapter, a story about invisible walls. As the plane continued to fill, Malik kept reading, or at least pretending to. His mind wasn't on the words anymore. The man across from him, now comfortable under his blanket, struck up a light conversation with a woman a row ahead. Their voices low, cordial. Occasionally, the man chuckled. Malik flipped the page without reading it. Another flight attendant, younger and darker-haired, paused as he passed through the aisle. He glanced at Malik's row, then back toward the galley, then continued on. He didn't stop either. The final boarding call echoed faintly from the intercom. Outside, the tarmac buzzed with activity. Inside, everything quieted. The door sealed shut with a soft hiss. A few rows ahead, a woman rang the call button for a ginger ale and received it within 60 seconds. Malik counted. It took 14 minutes before he saw the same cart approach his row. This time, the younger attendant stopped. He looked at Malik for the first time. Would you like something to drink, sir? Malik nodded. Just water, thanks. The attendant returned with the cup quickly, and Malik nodded in thanks. That was all. He sipped once. Then he waited. The blonde attendant came back through moments later, speaking briefly with the man across from him, who laughed at something she said. She glanced over at Malik then, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Without a word, she moved on. Malik watched her go. The air still felt cold. The blanket never arrived. He pulled his journal from his bag and flipped it open across his lap. On a half-used page, he wrote a single sentence in neat block letters. Even silence has a volume. Behind him, a man cleared his throat loudly, muttered something under his breath about delays and incompetence. In front of him, a woman unwrapped a protein bar and tapped through her phone, the glow of the screen reflecting off her glasses. No one spoke to him. The plane taxied slowly down the runway. Outside, the sun dipped low on the horizon. The hum of the engines grew steadier as Flight 819 leveled into cruising altitude, the seatbelt signs flicking off with a soft chime, releasing the first-class cabin into that brief intermission between takeoff and meal service. Passengers began to stretch, sip, scroll. But in Seat 2A, Malik remained still, his posture unchanged, his notebook resting open in his lap with that single stark line still visible. He hadn't written anything more. He hadn't needed to. Not yet. Across the aisle, the man in 2B leaned back in his seat with a satisfied sigh, cocooned in his blanket, now flicking casually through his tablet. Rows ahead, the cabin buzzed with quiet motion. And at the rear of first class, near the curtain that separated them from the main cabin, the blonde flight attendant stood angled slightly away from view, her hand pressed discreetly to her earpiece. She murmured something low and indistinct into the mic, then turned, catching sight of a younger attendant from earlier. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She gestured for him to join her in the galley. He hesitated only a second before slipping through the aisle and into the narrow kitchen space, where metal drawers clicked shut and steam hissed faintly from a warming tray. The blonde was already waiting. Her voice dropped sharp and low. "Something's off with 2A, she said. He keeps watching everything. Doesn't talk. Just writes. I don't like the energy." The younger attendant blinked, confused. "He asked for a blanket earlier. That's all." She cut him off. "People are noticing. He's unsettling the passengers." The younger one frowned. "Nobody's complained." She leaned in. "Trust your gut. This is the kind of guy that ends up in reports after the fact. Don't wait for the damage to be done." Without another word, she reached into her apron, pulled out her company-issued phone, and tapped it open. With a quick flick of a lens, she turned the camera across the curtain and snapped a silent photo through the crack in the galley partition, just enough to capture Malik seated still in 2A, gaze forward, notebook in lap. In the photo, he looked unaware, reflective even. But that wasn't how she framed it. She uploaded the image to the internal alert thread, tagging it with a note. Possible issue. Passenger in 2A behaving erratically. May need watch. That was all it took. Within seconds, the cockpit received the message. The pilot, glancing up from his flight monitor, scanned the alert. His co-pilot leaned over, reading it aloud. The pilot's brow furrowed. He didn't say anything at first. Then he picked up the internal intercom, connected to cabin control. "Keep an eye. If it escalates, let me know immediately. No mistakes today." Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Malik shifted slightly in his seat, reaching down to adjust his bag. The moment his hand brushed the floor, the blonde attendant emerged from the galley once more, this time slower, her eyes trained on him with discreet intensity. She didn't approach. She didn't offer anything. She just watched. Malik noticed. Of course he did. He had spent years recognizing that look, the look of someone who had already made a decision about him, someone who was waiting not for him to prove her wrong, but for him to make her suspicions right. He returned her gaze briefly, then turned his eyes back to the notebook. He began writing again, his pen moving without hurry. Behind him, in row 4D, a woman stirred restlessly in her seat. She whispered something to her husband, nodding discreetly toward the front cabin. Malik didn't see it, but the blonde attendant did. She turned immediately and approached the couple with a soft murmur. "Everything okay this evening?" The woman offered a polite smile. "Just wondering, who's that gentleman up front? He seems different." The attendant nodded slowly. "We're monitoring him, ma'am. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, don't hesitate to let us know." She straightened and moved back toward the galley. The younger attendant watched the exchange from a distance. His jaw tightened slightly. He didn't agree with what was happening, but years in the industry had taught him the unspoken rule of seniority. Don't interfere unless it gets loud. So he said nothing. From the cockpit, another alert pinged back. Confirm a subject is traveling alone. The flight manifest showed a solo ticket. The flight manager, now informed, stepped quietly into the aisle from the front service area. He moved with practiced grace, stopping at row 3 to speak with a frequent flyer. But his eyes slid right past them, subtly scanning Malik from head to toe. He lingered for 3 rows, then returned to the galley. The pilot called in again. If needed, divert protocol can be activated. Just say the word. The situation had escalated behind the scenes without a single word exchanged in the cabin. Malik remained unaware of the full extent, though something inside him had shifted. The weight of unseen judgment, of silent accusations, was a sensation he had grown up knowing intimately. It started with a blanket and now hummed beneath the surface like pressure in a sealed cabin. He closed his notebook gently, slid it into his bag, and glanced out the window. Above the clouds, everything looked clean. The blonde flight attendant returned once again, her expression a mask of professionalism, but her eyes revealed a restrained urgency. She moved toward his seat with exaggerated calm, stopping just short of his personal space before clearing her throat softly, a gesture meant to draw attention without causing alarm. "Mr. Thomas," she said, "we're going to need you to change seats. There's been reassignment from operations." Malik blinked, eyebrows lifting slightly, the only reaction he gave. The words settled into the cabin like fog, slow but suffocating. Passengers nearby turned their heads, subtly but unmistakably. Malik tilted his head to meet her gaze, his voice steady. "I don't understand. This is my assigned seat." The attendant's posture stiffened. "Yes, sir, it was. But corporate sent through a late directive. We have a passenger with specialized seating requirements. We'll need you to relocate to 12C. Malik didn't move. His voice remained level. "That's economy. I paid for this seat." Her tone didn't change, but the volume rose just enough to carry. "Sir, I'm going to need your cooperation so we can continue service without delay." That was the moment the murmurs began. A middle-aged man in one seat turned slightly in his seat and chuckled softly. "Just switch, pal, it's not that deep." The laugh was light, offhand, but it pierced the air like glass. Another voice, a woman this time, added, "Some people really don't know their place." The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. The damage had already been done. A few passengers glanced at one another, sharing knowing looks, as if they'd seen this story unfold before. Malik remained seated, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was collecting, measuring. Behind the curtain, the younger flight attendant stood frozen, his face tight with restraint. He'd seen the exchange unfold in silence, the pretext so flimsy it barely held together under scrutiny. He stepped forward, but hesitated at the edge of the aisle, uncertain whether to intervene or obey the hierarchy that had already spoken through protocol. Malik slowly reached for his bag under the seat and pulled it forward. The gesture was calm, composed, as if he were simply retrieving a book. But instead, he stood, shoulders squared, eyes sweeping across the faces now trained on him. Some looked away, others met his gaze only briefly before turning back to their screens or drink trays. No one spoke again. No one needed to. The silence was confirmation. The blonde attendant gestured toward the aisle, a triumphant glint flashing behind her false smile. "Thank you for your understanding," she said. "Your new seat is being prepared." Malik walked with measured steps down the narrow aisle, his feet striking the carpet with the weight of a man who had carried this burden too many times before. His eyes didn't drop, his shoulders didn't fold, but with every step, the message echoed around the cabin. "You do not belong here." As he passed row 4, a teenage boy wearing noise-canceling headphones slid them off and glanced up. His mother nudged him sharply, whispering something under her breath, her tone sharp, her eyes locked on Malik, with an uneasiness she didn't bother hiding. Malik said nothing. He didn't pause. He reached row 12 and settled into 12C, the middle seat between a man snoring softly on the left and a woman cradling a travel pillow on the right. The space was cramped, the legroom non-existent, the armrest already claimed. Malik folded his jacket in his lap and leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. The move had been surgical, public enough to signal his exclusion, polite enough to avoid outrage, calculated enough to imply legitimacy. But it wasn't random. It was theater, and the entire cabin had been the audience. Back in first class, the blonde attendant returned to her post near the galley, checking items off a tablet, her voice low and satisfied. The older man in 1C raised his glass. "See, that's how you handle it," he murmured to his seatmate. Assertive, but clean. That man didn't look like he belonged up here anyway. Some heads nodded faintly in agreement. A woman flipped the page of her magazine with deliberate disinterest. The theater had concluded, but below the surface, tension continued to simmer. The younger attendant passed through the economy section with a tray of beverages. As he reached row 12, he paused briefly. Malik looked up, but neither spoke. The tray lowered slightly. He placed a glass of water on Malik's tray without a word. Then he moved on. In the cockpit, the pilot received another message. Passenger reassigned successfully. All secure. He acknowledged with a single key press and turned his attention back to the sky. Meanwhile, Malik sat still, the quiet hum of the engine like static in his ears. The message had been received loud and clear. Not just about class, not just about protocol, but about power. The memory of being removed from 2A was still fresh, and the laughter, the murmurs, the way the cabin watched like spectators at a quiet execution still rang in his ears. He had moved without resistance, not out of weakness, but because he understood the rules of this theater. Power didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered with a smile and left its mark in silence. 10 minutes passed before a different flight attendant, a tall man in his 30s with neatly parted hair and a clipboard tucked under one arm, approached from the front cabin. His smile was professional, but Malik could see the distance in his eyes, the same distance that had followed him since boarding. The man leaned in slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "Sir, I just wanted to follow up on the seat adjustment. Our records show there was an issue with your frequent flyer verification. We reserved the first-class cabin for passengers with verified elite status." Malik blinked once, then slowly reached into the side pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small leather wallet and opened it with calm precision. Inside was a sleek metal card, dark silver, engraved with his full name and a platinum designation that shimmered under the overhead light. He handed it over without a word, locking eyes with the man as he did. The attendant accepted it, his fingers hesitating for just a moment. Then he scanned the card with a handheld device clipped to his waistband. The screen blinked green. A brief pause followed. Then the man smiled again, but something had changed. The smile no longer reached even the surface of his face. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Everything appears to be in order." But unfortunately, the reassignment had already been processed. There's nothing we can do mid-flight. We do apologize for the inconvenience. Malik didn't blink. He didn't take the card back right away. He let the silence stretch between them until the man shifted slightly, uncomfortable now, before Malik finally retrieved the card and slid it back into his wallet. The message had been delivered. His status was valid. His presence had been legitimate. But legitimacy had never been the issue. It was not about rules. It was about perception. And now the lie had been exposed. But no one would acknowledge it. Not truly. The attendant turned to leave, but before he stepped away, he added, "It's just protocol, sir. Nothing personal." Malik watched him go, the words hanging like smoke. He had heard them before. They always came with that same carefully neutral tone, that same finality. Protocol, the shield used to disguise exclusion. Policy, the excuse handed out when no apology would suffice. Nothing personal, when it had always been personal. Around him, the other passengers in economy carried on, unaware or unwilling to look his way. The woman beside him scrolled through vacation photos. The man on the other side continued snoring. The flight crew moved up and down the aisles with trays of prepackaged snacks, offering hollow pleasantries and sugar-stained smiles. When they reached Malik's row, a different attendant, a young woman with tired eyes, offered him a choice between 2 boxes of processed meals. Malik declined with a shake of the head, but she left one anyway, murmuring something that sounded like a script. "For your comfort." He didn't touch it. Back in first class, the blonde attendant and her supervisor reviewed a digital manifest on the in-flight console near the galley. The supervisor, the same one who had spoken to Malik earlier, tapped through the passenger data. His voice was low. It scanned valid. "He's been with the program 10 years. The blonde replied with a shrug. "Maybe he borrowed someone's card. You never know with these things." Her tone was light, but the implication thickened the air. The supervisor didn't reply immediately. Then he sighed, pushed the console closed, and said, "We just need to make sure everyone feels safe. It's not about just one passenger. It's about the entire cabin experience. Safety, comfort, experience." Malik had heard them all before. Words rearranged to mean the same thing, to justify the same exclusion. In his seat, he retrieved his notebook once more, turning to a blank page. He didn't write yet. Instead, he looked up, scanning the cabin. He saw the careful glances, the studied avoidance. He knew they didn't need a reason. They only needed a feeling. And he had given them one, by existing where he wasn't expected. The truth now was simple. He had been moved not because he lacked status or payment. He had been moved because the story of who he was didn't match the seat he sat in. Because their image of a premium passenger didn't look like him, even when the data said otherwise, even when the card proved otherwise. The flight continued. Clouds drifted below. His hands rested on his thighs, motionless, until he finally reached into his inner coat pocket and retrieved his phone. The device lit up in his hand, casting a faint glow across his fingers. He wasn't filming. Not yet. But the thought was there: document, record, protect. The world outside the cabin saw what it was shown. Without evidence, everything that had happened could be folded back into policy and protocol and forgotten before the wheels touched down. Malik unlocked the phone and angled it discreetly toward the row in front of him. But before he could tap the screen, the blonde attendant appeared once more, materializing with uncanny timing. Her expression calm, but sharpened with pretense. Her voice was just loud enough to carry a few rows. "Sir, for security reasons, recording is prohibited inside the cabin. Please put your device away." The air shifted immediately. Passengers turned to look, some subtly, others directly. Malik didn't respond. He held her gaze for a long second before lowering the phone to his lap, not powering it off, but not recording either. The attendant didn't leave. She remained, her body language rigid, her arms folded behind her back in that firm but passive stance reserved for formal confrontation. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." Malik finally placed the phone face down on the tray, locking the screen. She gave a nod that resembled approval, but the corners of her mouth twitched slightly. She turned to walk away, but a new voice stopped her. An elderly woman seated in 13A leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but firm. "Excuse me, but I don't understand." He wasn't disturbing anyone. Her husband, seated beside her, added with measured calm, "We saw what happened. He was removed from first class without cause. Now he's being warned for using his phone? That doesn't seem right." The attendant turned sharply, still polite, but now clipped. "I understand your concern, sir, ma'am, but we have procedures. This is for everyone's safety." The old man blinked. His voice remained low. "It looks like something else to me. Something personal." She smiled again, this time colder. "If you're uncomfortable with our security policies, I can speak with the captain about removing you at the next stop." The couple fell silent. Not because they agreed, but because the message was clear. The warning wasn't just for Malik anymore. It was for anyone who dared to question the theater as it played out. The attendant walked away slowly, returning to the galley, leaving a hush in her wake. Malik sat still, his body unchanged, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. Not from fear, from clarity, from recognition. He had not disrupted the flight. He had not raised his voice, violated protocol, or created discomfort. But the narrative was already being shaped without his participation. A story was being written where he was the risk, the threat, the problem. And now, even those who questioned it became liabilities. The elderly couple sat back in their seats, subdued. The woman reached for her husband's hand and squeezed it gently. No more words passed between them. In the cockpit, the flight manager sent another internal message. Passenger 2A successfully monitored. Minor escalation diffused. Continue to observe. Back in the economy cabin, Malik stared out the window. The sky beyond the glass was cloudless, serene. But inside, the cabin had become a maze of silent accusations. Every action was now subject to interpretation. Every gesture could be twisted into justification. His attempt to document the injustice had not been met with inquiry or understanding. It had been framed as a violation, as a threat. Even the simplest effort to assert presence was treated as aggression. The system had turned defensive the moment he challenged its story. And now the crew didn't just want him silent. They needed him invisible. A few rows ahead, a mother tried to distract her child with an in-flight game, glancing back toward Malik with subtle unease. Two businessmen in button-down shirts whispered quietly behind raised hands. The passengers around him had received their message. The lines had been drawn, and no one, not even a quiet man with a platinum card and a first-class seat, was immune from being placed on the wrong side of them. Malik tapped his fingers slowly against the tray. Not in anger, not in frustration, but in thought. He understood now. This wasn't a moment. It was a pattern, a system, a design. The silence after the confrontation with the elderly couple confirmed it. Even those who knew the truth had been forced to sit back and swallow it. And that meant the story being built wasn't just about him. The elderly couple too rose back, sat frozen, their hands still intertwined, expressions grim with the weight of what they had witnessed and their inability to stop it. Malik had not spoken since the last exchange, but his silence had now become its own indictment. The blonde flight attendant re-emerged from the galley with a clipboard in hand, her movements swift, precise, and rehearsed. She leaned in to whisper something to the flight manager, who stood just behind the curtain dividing economy from business. He nodded once, pressed his earpiece, and disappeared into the cockpit without ceremony. 30 seconds later, the soft chime of the intercom broke through the low murmur of passengers and engines alike. The captain's voice, calm but authoritative, filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay in service. At this time, we are holding our flight pattern due to a security compliance matter involving a passenger who has not adhered to crew instructions. We appreciate your patience while we resolve the situation. The words were delivered with surgical distance. They did not name names. They did not assign blame. But the effect was immediate. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. All attention drifted toward the man in seat 12C, whose only violation was attempting to record his own mistreatment and declining a meal he didn't request. Malik didn't flinch. He sat straight, composed, his jaw set. He had heard such language before, words engineered to shift suspicion while preserving plausible deniability, the kind that didn't accuse outright but encouraged assumption. And the assumption now hung heavy in the cabin. The whispers began almost immediately. A woman in 10B murmured something to her seatmate. A man behind Malik shifted uncomfortably in his seat. An overhead compartment clicked shut with just a little too much force. The blonde attendant approached again, this time flanked by the flight manager and another crew member with a small tablet device in hand. Her voice was softer now, almost apologetic, as though cloaking the blade in velvet. Mr. Thomas, we're going to need to ask you to disembark the aircraft. A ground team is waiting to speak with you. It won't take long. Malik turned his head slowly, locking eyes with her. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. But he didn't move. The second crew member stepped closer, voice firming. For the safety of everyone on board, we need to proceed with your cooperation. Malik nodded once, then reached down for his bag. The weight of 100 eyes pressed down upon him, but none dared to meet his directly. The passengers, who had just an hour earlier ignored him in first class, now watched him like a spectacle. Some masked their discomfort with indifference. Others watched with morbid curiosity. But no one spoke. Not one. As Malik rose and stepped into the aisle, the silence thickened. The cabin noise died. Even the child behind him, who had spent the earlier part of the flight tapping on a screen and kicking a tray table, sat perfectly still now, as if sensing something larger was unfolding. Malik moved slowly, deliberately, with no aggression, no resistance. But he moved with the gravity of a man walking through a trial, staged to look like procedure. Each step toward the exit became a judgment. The aisle felt longer than it had ever been. He passed the rows of passengers, some shrinking away slightly, others holding their breath. None offered their hand. None offered a word. When he reached the forward galley, the captain himself had emerged from the cockpit, arms folded behind his back, expression blank. He nodded at Malik without speaking. Just protocol. That's what they would say later. The compliance team requested it. The flight crew followed safety procedure. No one was targeted. It wasn't personal. But Malik knew the truth in his bones. This wasn't about policy. It was about power. It was about maintaining a structure where certain people must always justify their presence. And when that presence made others uncomfortable, even without cause, the system would adjust, not to protect the truth, but to protect the illusion. As he stepped through the threshold and onto the jet bridge, two men in dark uniforms stood waiting. They didn't wear police badges, but their posture carried the same message. Their hands rested on radios. Their eyes were already scanning him, not for threats, but for weakness. One of them stepped forward, voice calm. "Mr. Thomas, if you'll follow us, we just need to clear up a report filed by the crew. It won't take long." Malik looked past them, toward the terminal gate visible at the end of the walkway. He didn't look back. He simply walked until he reached a quiet corner near an empty window facing the tarmac. Planes rolled past in the distance, their movements mechanical and precise, but none carried the weight of what had just transpired. His hand slid into the inner pocket of his coat and retrieved the phone they had tried so hard to make him put away. He unlocked the screen, scrolled through his contacts without hurry, and tapped a number marked only by a single letter. D. The phone rang once, then connected. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but carried a depth that demanded no echo. "It's me. Time to proceed." There was a pause on the other end, short but significant. He listened, then nodded slightly. Yes. They crossed the line. Full authorization. The call lasted 22 seconds. No raised voice. No emotion. Just instruction. Just signal. When it ended, Malik stood still for a moment longer, the phone loose in his grip, his gaze distant. He knew what would come next. He didn't need to hope for justice. He had arranged for it. 30 minutes later, in a sleek, glass-walled office 2 time zones away, a phone began to ring. Then another, and another. Executives glanced up from conference tables as red lights blinked to life across their desk phones. The head of corporate compliance reached for his receiver and heard only a cold voice on the line identifying itself as the Department of Aviation Oversight. "We have reason to believe a federal contractor under your purview has violated Section 413 of the Civil Equity and Passenger Rights Mandate. We are opening an investigation into your conduct during Flight 819. Please ensure all communications and flight logs are preserved for immediate audit." Across the hall, the CEO of the airline was pulled from a meeting with foreign investors as his assistant approached, face pale. "Sir, we've received 6 federal inquiries in the last 9 minutes. They're invoking emergency audit protocol." In the cockpit of Flight 819, now midair once again, the captain received a coded message on his terminal. He read it twice, then handed it to the co-pilot without a word. The blonde attendant continued her service routine as if nothing had happened, but a quiet tension began to build in the corners of the cabin. Things were moving now that she could no longer see or control. In the airport, Malik had taken a seat near a window. He was no longer checking his phone. He wasn't recording. He wasn't waiting for headlines. He simply watched the sky. He knew the storm he had triggered would not make a sound until it landed. In Washington, a list of flag carriers was updated in real time. Flight 819's flight number blinked red on the oversight board. Internal audit divisions began pulling employee records, scanning for previous complaints against crew, cross-referencing them with unresolved bias claims filed over the last 18 months. The system that had been designed to bury incidents like Malik's was now working against itself, exposing buried memos and internal notes never meant for public light. In the PR office of the airline, the communications director stared at the alert summary with a growing sense of dread. Media hold request from regulatory agency. All outbound statements must be cleared through legal. A senior VP asked aloud, "Who is this guy? Who the hell is Malik Thomas?" The question hung in the room for several seconds before a junior analyst answered without looking up from his screen. "He's not just a passenger. He's lead counsel for the Department of Civil Aviation Standards. His division oversees all contractor compliance for air safety and passenger discrimination." A pause swept through the room like a vacuum. One executive let out a quiet breath. "We just threw a federal regulator off our plane." The analyst nodded. "Not just a regulator. He's the one who wrote the damn compliance policy we're violating." At that exact moment, across the airport, Malik stood from his chair. He adjusted his cuffs, returned the phone to his pocket, and began walking again, not quickly, not urgently, but with the quiet weight of inevitability. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten anyone. The system would speak for him now. He had designed it that way. Back inside Flight 819, the blonde attendant finally noticed the subtle shift in the cabin atmosphere. A whisper passed between two crew members near the galley. "Something's wrong. They just got a direct order from corporate to flag all logs. The captain wants a full incident report sent mid-flight." Her smile faltered. For the first time in hours, doubt crept into her expression. In a small government office near the Capitol, a printed memo was passed between desks. Recommendation: suspend Skylux Airlines from federal transport contracts, pending outcome of immediate investigation. Possible penalties include multi-year decertification. Inside the executive floor of the airline's headquarters, legal counsel, senior executives, and compliance managers had been summoned for an emergency briefing. Phones had rung through the night. Internal systems had flagged Malik Thomas's name across multiple databases. The image of his boarding pass, still archived in the passenger manifest, now lived on the screens of attorneys and auditors from 3 different agencies. Overnight, the Department of Civil Aviation Standards had issued a temporary freeze on all federal safety and security certifications, pending an in-person inspection. By mid-morning, the unthinkable became real. A federal transport marshal, 2 auditors, and Malik himself arrived at the tarmac under quiet but urgent escort. Dressed not in business casual, but in a tailored charcoal suit with a federal badge clipped to his lapel, Malik stepped out of the black sedan onto the service road, the wind catching the edge of his overcoat as the officials joined him. The same plane, Flight 819, sat at the gate, now scheduled for a short domestic jump, unaware of what was about to unfold. The airline had been given notice of an immediate compliance check, but not who was conducting it. That knowledge came only when Malik entered the concourse, flanked by the audit team. His presence turned heads not for who he was, but for what he represented. A shift, a reckoning. The gate crew recognized him immediately. The expressions on their faces morphed from polite confusion to stark recognition in seconds. The agent who had scanned his ticket the day before stepped back instinctively. The flight crew had already boarded. Malik and the inspectors passed the checkpoint without a word. The blonde attendant, reviewing a tray of sealed service items in the galley, looked up and froze. The younger attendant beside her, The only one who had hesitated to obey the initial orders the day before swallowed hard as he saw Malik again, this time not quiet, not seated, but standing with authority and surrounded by federal oversight. Malik didn't speak immediately. One of the inspectors moved forward, flashed identification, and addressed the captain, who emerged from the cockpit looking pale, unsure. "We are here to conduct a formal review of a passenger interaction that took place on this aircraft during Flight 819. All crew will be debriefed individually. All in-flight communication logs, incident reports, and internal notes will be secured for review. Compliance begins now." The captain tried to respond but was cut off. Malik remained silent, letting the weight of the moment rest where it belonged. Then a passenger stepped forward. She was in her 30s, soft-spoken, eyes tired but resolute. She had been in seat 13D, 2 rows behind Malik. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone. "I recorded everything. I didn't mean to, I just felt like something was off. I kept it quiet. I didn't want trouble. But you should hear it." The inspector took the phone and played the audio. The room fell silent. The device played back the blonde attendant's voice, unmistakably sharp, saying, "He's just trying to provoke. I've seen this before. Let him try. If he records anything, we'll just say he threatened someone." Another crew member's voice followed, lower, nervous. "Should we report that?" The woman again, "Just flag him. Say he refused to follow instructions. It's enough. They always cave when we go formal." The captain's face drained of color. The younger attendant looked down at the floor. Malik remained still, unmoved. But inside, every word confirmed what he had already known. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been a tactic, a script, a quiet act of displacement disguised as procedure. Now the curtain had dropped. Now the audience could hear what had played out behind it. The inspector looked up from the phone. "Thank you, ma'am. This recording will be submitted as primary evidence under Section 212 of the Federal Passenger Protection Mandate." To the crew, he added, "You are advised not to delete or modify any report from yesterday's flight. Doing so will be considered obstruction." The woman who had provided the recording stepped back, eyes wide, still unsure of what she had just set in motion. Malik turned to her and gave a single nod. Not of gratitude, of recognition. She had done what no one on that plane had. She had refused to stay silent. In the airport terminal, word spread quickly. Employees whispered. Ground staff pulled out phones. Screens lit up with text reading. He came back. With agents. It's real. The news moved faster than any official memo. By the time Malik and the inspection team exited the aircraft, an entire wing of the airline's compliance office had been locked into legal review. Senior staff were instructed to remain on standby. Internal messages warned against deletion of communication logs. Inboxes were quarantined. The incident had passed the point of recovery. No statement could spin this. No apology could cover it. The proof was digital. The voice recordings undeniable. All contracts related to maintenance operations, emergency procedure evaluations, and aircrew training programs were placed on indefinite hold pending full review. Within the hour, the Department of Civil Aviation Standards issued a second order, formally revoking Skylux's eligibility to bid on any new federal flight safety agreements until further notice. That single clause alone voided the renewal of a $2.1 billion multi-year safety contract awarded just 6 months earlier. The effect was immediate and devastating. The company's general counsel, now surrounded by a team of crisis managers, called an emergency shareholder briefing. But by the time they gathered in the conference room, the news had already made it to the markets. Business outlets began to circulate internal memos leaked from overnight audits, and headlines rolled across digital tickers with biting accuracy. Federal audit halts Skylux operations. Whistleblower exposure leads to contract collapse. At 10:12 a.m., trading for Skylux stock was paused after a 34% drop in less than 45 minutes. Financial analysts who had rated the airline as stable just 2 weeks earlier revised their predictions to critical risk. Legal departments from two major partner carriers requested immediate clarification on their shared routes. The company's phones didn't stop ringing. Neither did the regulators. Within the airline's corporate headquarters, silence clung to the hallways like smoke. The internal messaging platform was flooded with system notices. Emails were frozen for record-keeping. Supervisors received compliance flags beside the names of any employee involved in the handling of Flight 819. At the top of that list were three names already familiar to the passengers from the day before: Lauren Davis, lead flight attendant; Michael Hesse, captain, Flight 819; Ruth Nolan, head of ground operations, Terminal C. Each name carried an attached incident tag. Each tag led to a file now labeled formally referred for personnel action, Level 1. The company issued termination notices before noon. The three individuals were escorted from their respective offices under discreet supervision. There were no confrontations, no arguments, only resignation. Word of their dismissal spread within minutes, reaching not just employees, but the broader aviation community. Former coworkers shared screenshots confirming the news. Forums lit up with reactions, some celebratory, some defensive, but most simply stunned. These weren't entry-level staff. These were senior crew, trusted veterans, people who had once been seen as untouchable. Now their badges were deactivated, their pensions frozen pending review, their names entered into a national registry of personnel removed for misconduct related to discriminatory behavior under federal code. Public statements from the airline followed late in the afternoon, prepared in haste and stripped of substance. A spokesperson stood before cameras reading from a teleprompter, offering sympathies for what they called a regrettable incident, and promising to listen, learn, and grow. But the words rang hollow against the background of legal action now unfolding behind them. Civil rights organizations had already filed formal complaints. Advocacy groups demanded further investigation. Anonymous testimonies from former staff began to surface online, describing similar treatment of other passengers. Incidents that never made the news, that never reached an audit, that ended quietly because no one had the power to challenge the narrative. Until now, Malik's name had not been mentioned in the statement, but his presence was felt in every sentence. Every camera turned toward the podium, every question asked. By evening, major publications ran with the headline, "Passenger who sparked federal shakeup was architect of safety reform bill." News anchors referred to him as the man who forced the industry to face itself. Editorials praised his restraint. Some questioned his silence. But all acknowledged one undeniable fact: this wasn't revenge. It was regulation. This wasn't chaos. It was consequence. Malik remained out of view that day. He didn't appear on talk shows. He didn't hold interviews. He let the facts speak. He let the recordings speak. He let the law do what it was written to do. But within the halls of power, in regulatory circles, legal forums, and executive briefings, his decision to act had reshaped an entire conversation about passenger treatment, power dynamics, and the structures that protect discrimination behind corporate policy. At dusk, a final message was released from the Department of Civil Aviation Standards. We remind all carriers that policies are not protection from accountability. When service becomes a shield for exclusion, we will respond. Behind that statement was Malik's voice. 6 months had passed since Flight 819 triggered the collapse of a carefully curated illusion. The headlines had faded from front pages, the stock had stabilized under emergency restructuring, and new executives had taken their places in boardrooms with promises of reform laced into their statements. The federal investigation had concluded, handing down its final rulings with clarity. Skylux Airlines paid heavy fines, lost access to government bidding for the foreseeable future, and was required to overhaul internal bias training under third-party oversight. But the true shift didn't happen in courtrooms or offices. It happened in people. The story hadn't been forgotten. It had simply gone quiet, settling like dust into the corners of a new narrative still being written. And on a soft spring afternoon in downtown Atlanta, beneath the hum of distant traffic and the smell of fresh concrete warmed by the sun, that story took on a new form. A youth aviation outreach center stood 3 blocks from the edge of the city's industrial district. It wasn't flashy, just a 2-story building with wide windows, a hangar-style workshop in the rear, and a single sign over the entrance reading Lift Pathways. Inside, students in oversized shirts and worn sneakers clustered around tables lined with model turbines, cockpit simulators, and job interview worksheets. Posters of black aviators and women in captain uniforms lined the walls. The air buzzed not with technology, but with belief in access, in potential, in dignity reclaimed. At the front of the main hall, Lauren Davis, no longer in uniform, no longer hiding behind polished protocol, stood with a binder tucked under one arm and a group of students before her. She didn't speak with authority anymore. She spoke with effort, with hesitation. Her voice no longer carried the sharp edge of command. It carried the weight of memory. She had applied to volunteer quietly, under a different name at first, hoping to contribute in a place where her history wouldn't define her. But the director had known. They had looked her in the eye and asked one question: "What do you want from this?" And she had answered, not with excuses, not with justification, but with a truth that had taken her 6 months to form. "I want to undo what I've helped build." That answer hadn't erased what she had done. It hadn't absolved her, but it had opened a door. And so she stood now not as a mentor, not as an expert, but as someone learning how to be accountable. She taught safety procedure to kids who had never flown. She taught how to read cockpit dials, how to communicate clearly under pressure, and how to understand that authority is earned, not taken. She never mentioned Flight 819, but some of the older students knew. They had seen the video, read the threads, followed the fallout, and yet they still listened. Because redemption wasn't about forgetting. It was about proving that truth mattered more than image. Outside the center, under a maple tree planted near the edge of the parking lot, Malik stood with his hands in the pockets of a lightweight coat, watching through the wide glass pane as the students moved through the room. His presence was not announced. He hadn't scheduled a meeting. He had simply come. And when his eyes landed on Lauren, standing quietly as a boy asked her about wind speed conversion, he said nothing. He didn't walk inside. He didn't confront. He simply observed. His expression was unreadable, not hard, not forgiving, just still. The kind of stillness that comes from having seen too much and judged too little. One of the program's coordinators stepped beside him, their clipboard resting against a hip, unsure whether to speak. Malik glanced at them briefly, then nodded once, not asking for access or attention. "I just wanted to see for myself." The coordinator nodded back. She shows up early, stays late, doesn't talk about her past, just listens, learns. Malik smiled faintly. That was enough. He turned and began to walk, each step deliberate, unhurried, the breeze lifting the hem of his coat as he moved toward the street. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the world hadn't been fixed, but something had shifted. Justice, after all, wasn't always loud. Sometimes arrived like this, quiet, unnoticed, complete. Inside the center, Lauren continued her lesson. The boy asked again, uncertain of his calculation. She walked him through the formula, guiding his hand across the notepad until his brow lifted in realization. "That's right," she said. "You got it." He smiled, then returned to his work. Lauren exhaled slowly, watching him, unaware that Malik had been there at all. But even if she had known, she wouldn't have asked for anything more than this moment. A chance to rebuild. A chance to be part of something she once denied. A chance to face the truth and not look away. The world moved forward, but what had happened on Flight 819 remained. A scar, a warning, and a quiet reminder that power without conscience corrodes everything it touches. Malik had seen it. He had lived it. And now, finally, he had outlived it. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter in our journey for truth and justice. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Do you believe people can truly change after making a mistake? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're there, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.